Okay. Beginning Pashas Tazria, Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor. Daber el Bnei Yisrael Lemor. You should speak to Bnei Yisrael saying, Isha ki Tazria, V'yolda Zocher. Woman who conceives and gives birth to a male. V'toma Shivas Yomim. Ki mei nidas dvosa tikmo. When she gives birth to the male, the degree of contamination which comes upon her is the equivalent of the contamination of a woman who has a flow, a menstruant. Just give you the reality. It's hard to relate to in the fact that the Torah tells us regarding a menstruant, if a woman sees even a droplet of blood, menstrual blood, she's classified as a nida, as a menstruant. Torah says a menstruant on a Torah level is contaminated for 7 days. Whether she sees continuously for 7 days or she sees even a droplet of blood, which is no longer larger than a mustard seed, which is tiny, she's contaminated for 7 days. The 8th day comes, she goes to the mikvah, the 8th night, she's permitted to her husband, she no longer contaminates. No longer contaminates. A woman who gives birth to a male, even if there's no menstrual blood, I mean, let's say the woman is so malnourished, when she gives birth, it's considered, it's a dry birth. No blood comes out of her. The birthing act itself, giving birth to a male, causes the same level of contamination as a woman who menstruates. Therefore, she's contaminated for 7 days. We'll discuss it later. But the first Rashi is an important Rashi. In the previous portion, we spoke about the kosher species and the non-kosher species. This was discussed in Parsha Shmini. The domesticated animals, undomesticated animals, to be classified as a kosher species, it has to have two signs. It has to chew its cud, and it has to have split hooves. That is the indicator that it's kosher species. If it only has one of the two or neither of the two, it's classified as non-kosher species. We spoke about what determines whether fish is a kosher species, non-kosher species. If it has fins and scales, it's a kosher species. If not, it's not a kosher species. And it spoke about grasshoppers, what's a kosher species, what's a not a kosher species, and the various classifications of species, whatever they were. That was discussed first. And then afterwards, we speak about the laws which pertain to the human being. What causes contamination, whether it's a male, whether it's a female, which we discussed, there's a difference. If the woman gives birth to a male, the degree of contamination is 7 days. And even if beyond 7 days, she continues to menstruate for 33 days, that 30-day period, she's not contaminated. Doesn't contaminate. If it's a female, she's contaminated. The woman gives birth for 14 days. And for 66 days, beyond that 14 days, if she went to the mikvah, although she continues to have the flow, even if she has the flow, that menstrual blood does not contaminate her. Why? Xeris HaKosov. The Torah says if it's due to the birth, although it's coming from the same source, she's not contaminated. Beyond the 7 days for the male for 33 days, and beyond the 14 days for a female for 66 days. That's what Torah says. Okay? So those are the laws which pertain to the human being, which determines to what degree is the woman contaminated, not contaminated, and so on and so forth. So the first Rashi, Omer Reb Simloi, Keshem she'itziroso shel odom acha kol behemo chai v'of masa breishis. Just as we find in time of creation, first all species were created, and the man at the very end was created. He came about at the very end. Kach toroso disparsho acha toras pe mechayvov. Identically, the laws which pertain to the person himself. This is also mentioned after the laws of the various animals, domesticated, undomesticated, birds, whatever they are, is discussed afterwards, it's stated afterwards. It's the same sequence of creation. Creation was first the unintelligible living species, then the human being. The laws which pertain first to the species, what determines what they are and not what they are, and then we speak about the laws which pertain to the person, to the human being. I mean, what is Reb Simloi? What's his insight? What's he sharing with me? What's the takeaway? What am I supposed to learn from this? As the human being was only created after all the other species, identically the laws which pertain to the animal were stated first, and then the laws pertain to the person. Now, we discussed if Adam and Eve are the essential and the center of the universe. They're the objective and the purpose of creation. Why were they created last? So if you remember, we mentioned Rabbeinu Bachya. He compares it to a person wants to have a home built, a residence built on a piece of property. When is the person summoned to come to the location? Only after the house is built. When the design is there, before the house is fully built, you don't ask the person to come because you're not ready to occupy that location. So the person himself would have no level of usage of that property and no level of function there. Identically, until the world was put in place and all the amenities to accommodate and to facilitate all the objective of the human being, there was no point in creating the human being. Because if the human being is the purpose of creation, everything that was created, what is the value of creating Adam and Eve before the world was created? And every aspect of amenity that was needed to facilitate his purpose. Therefore, Adam and Eve were created at the very end of creation on the sixth day, which only emphasizes what the value of the human being is. That the human being is the objective of creation. And everything was only created before him, only for his purpose to facilitate his objective, which he is the objective. Identically, Reb Simloi is saying that the Torah in its laws, first it discusses the laws, and then it discusses of the other species as they were created first. We discuss the laws which pertain to the human being. But factually speaking, it's not the same. They're not comparable, as we just explained. The reason why Adam and Eve were created at the end of creation is because everything had to be in place when they came on site. Because otherwise, what's the value of existence if they cannot function in their own capacity? Therefore, they were created at the end. So everything had to be created prior to Adam and Chava, and then they were created at the very end. But in terms of the laws, why can't we discuss the laws which first pertain to the human being? A woman who conceives, a male, a female, what are the laws pertaining to her levels of contamination? And then we could discuss afterwards the kosher, non-kosher species, whatever they may be, which pertains to the human being. I mean, seemingly they're not really comparable. Now, so I think what he's saying is this. Give you an example. The law is that a Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzah, the leather for the outer case and for the straps have to come from a kosher species. If the hide is from a non-kosher species, it's not valid. It's not valid. It doesn't qualify for Torah, tefillah, mezuzah. What about the gut in which you sew the various portions of the parchments together? Has to come from a kosher species. The parchment has to come from a kosher species. Even if the animal died, was not ritually slaughtered, as long as the species is a kosher species, it qualifies for all aspects of a Sefer Torah, tefillah, mezuzah. Non-kosher species, not. Now, kosher species, we said, determined it has to have two signs. It has to chew its cud and have split hooves. One and not both is not kosher. Now, why did God create a kosher species with a hide? Why? Do you know why? Because since there's a law of Torah, tefillah, mezuzah, therefore the animal has to have a hide, the kosher species. Because otherwise, the tefillah, mezuzah, and Sefer Torah, which are necessary for the human being, for the Jew, would not qualify. You need parchment, you need leather, and you need gut. Where do you get it from? So therefore, God created kosher species to facilitate the laws which pertain to the human being. As you need oxygen to breathe, and you need water to drink, you have the characteristics of the species have relevance to the what? To the spirituality of the Jew. As a result of that, when they were created as they were, it wasn't only created in the physical sense, even their profile and every aspect of their being, they were created to facilitate the spirituality of the Jew. Therefore, just as in creation, to emphasize this point, that they were created there and only the human being came at the very end when the world was in place. Otherwise, he couldn't function to any degree identically in terms of his spirituality. All the characteristics of the physicality of that animal and all the laws, for instance, a kosher species has 4 stomachs. A non-kosher species does not. An animal has a trachea and esophagus. When you slaughter the animal, you have to cut both of them, the majority of both of them, to be considered ritual slaughter. So all the characteristics of any species, the way it's created, this reflects and relates directly to the spirituality of the Jew. We had in last week's reading at the end, it says, Lahavdil bein haTorah vein hatomei, to discern between what's pure and what's not pure. So Rashi over there cites the Midrash. Are we speaking between a kosher species, non-kosher species? We don't need any discernment. It's obvious. The donkey looks like the donkey and the cow looks like the cow. So Rashi cites Chazal, the Midrash, to discern between something which is 50% ritually slaughtered and slightly more than 50%. If it's 50%, it's not valid. The animal is classified as the vela. It's a carcass. It's not kosher, and it generates spiritual contamination. If you slaughter it slightly more than 50%, that's considered ritual slaughter. Because there's a concept known as ruba kukulo, that when you slaughter the majority assumes the status as if you cut through both of those signs. So it's considered ritual slaughter. So that's what Bismillah is saying. That it's not only the physicality of the world preceded the human being to accommodate his existence in the physical sense, every aspect of those species were created before him, because their value is to facilitate the spirituality of the human being. That's what Bismillah is saying. Now, but Rashi doesn't cite the conclusion of Midrash. And if a person doesn't, if this is not the takeaway of the human being, you know what you say to him? You say, Yitush Kodmach. The flea preceded you. The flea. If you think you're so high and mighty, and therefore everything revolves around you, you realize You weren't the first one to be created. The flea was created before you were created. Therefore, this somehow takes the wind out of the sails of the person by somehow communicating this to him. If you understand everything had to be there to facilitate your physicality and spirituality, so then you understand what your value is. But if you don't buy into this and understand the takeaway from this, Yitush Kodmach, the flea preceded you. You know, the Mishnah tells us at the end of Kedushin, have you ever seen a bear being a porter? A bear has tremendous strength, but it's not a porter. It doesn't carry things on its back. Or did you ever see an animal which it worries about its livelihood? It lives, Hashem put them in their habitat, and they live. They exist. A human being, what does a human being have to do? We have to toil to maintain our existence. The animal doesn't have the worries or the needs in terms of, it doesn't impact the animal. It's just naturally, it exists. But in terms of its foraging for food, it's not really part of its existence in terms of it impacts on its being. A human being, this weighs heavily on a human being's existence. We have to cover our needs. That's the animal. The animal has less worry than the human being. So a person says, you know something, but I have this whole world to partake of. Is it so great? It's a known. The Rambam says that most illnesses are caused by eating things we shouldn't eat or overeating. Most illnesses are caused by that. So as much as you believe that the world is there for you to indulge in, but you know something? Who said that is so perfect and so valuable? All that indulgence and all the envy and all the strife and all the suffering is due to what? To all that it's available to you. So what's the value? Unless it has that spiritual component, being at the end doesn't say very much. But if you say that the essence of the human being is to facilitate his objective, and his objective is his spirituality, and everything is choice, then coming at the end, it speaks volumes of what the value of the human being is. But if a person knows the human being is, I'm an intellectual animal. I'm more advanced than the animal. And therefore, I'm more special. You could delude yourself. But you say to the person, Yitush Kodmach, the flea preceded you.